God has promised a river. Please hold on. In whatever desert you're facing, something is happening, maybe quietly, maybe secretly, but the seeds he's planted in you, they're sprouting in the dark, in some deep, dark place, in a lonely place, in a quiet place. I believe that restoration has begun. Maybe it's just a trickle, but it's there. So I want to encourage you to look for his rivers, to trust that they're there. Friday, November 24, 2023. Jiaoji Town's circumstances have worsened and all avenues are closed. Due to the high cost of living, some businesses are unable to open. Every time a jet fighter passes close to one of our villages, houses burn down. For us, hearing the broken voices is a nightmare. We must always remain vigilant. To me, the only reason we survived the night and are still here the next day is by God's grace. My 2-year-old daughter points out the bomb shelter to her father as she hears the voices of the jet fighters. She may have had a horrible first experience, but she is now prepared for everything and has stopped crying. When she hears gunshots, she yells at her brother and father. So yes, good morning. As was mentioned, June 20th was World Refugee Day. And it's currently estimated that there's over 120 million people worldwide who have been forcibly displaced from their homes and are in need of safety and protection. Today I'm sharing about why so many people in Myanmar specifically have been displaced and what dear friends and colleagues have taught me about following Jesus in the midst of daily distress, displacement, and trauma. So my name is Allison McKnight, as mentioned, and I worked in Southeast Asia for 12 years, working with humanitarian agencies with a focus on the issue of human trafficking. I spent time in Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Myanmar. I also worked in Nepal after the 2015 earthquake, and in Greece during the refugee crisis. Myanmar was my most recent posting, and I was there with my husband for 7 years, working for a Christian relief and development organization until the day our office had to shut. So before I begin, I just want to mention that I will be using some pseudonyms, some replacement names for the names of our Myanmar colleagues and any stories I share, or maybe not sharing their names at all, because this is going to be broadcasted online, and I want to be quite candid about what is happening in Myanmar, but that can be quite risky for people in Myanmar, so I just want to be cautious of that. So, what is happening in Myanmar? Myanmar's civil war has been characterized as one of the longest and most complex civil wars in the world. The military junta has been at war with resistance groups for over 70 years, and war continues even until this very day. The latest military coup in 2021 came after a period of delicate democracy where there was hope that the country would change. Just hope was blooming that the fighting would stop and the country would change. And I remember the day of the coup, and then seeing images of hundreds of thousands of civilians taking to the street across the country in peaceful protest. And it kind of crazy to think that this many people, and it was very peaceful, they were just walking the streets, wanting their democratically elected leaders to be reinstated. Paul and I lived on the 11th floor of our apartment building in Yangon, which is the economic capital of Myanmar. And I remember looking out to the street below and just seeing like thousands and thousands of people walking the street in peaceful protest. But then the military responded violently, as it has so often done repeatedly in the past. And we saw standoffs on the street below between protesters and the junta, and I remember tear gas, shootings, bombings. We saw images of protesters and medics being violently beaten by the junta, and a number of other things as well. So we witnessed the country just tailspin into social, political, and economic devastation, and our hearts broke for our Myanmar colleagues and their families and their communities who were watching their country just unravel at the seams. So 17.6 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, millions losing their jobs, companies pulling out, factories shutting down, trade and transport impeded, university students joining resistance groups to take up arms against the military junta, and then the junta forcibly conscripting youth into their ranks of their army. Military checkpoints all over the place, and then millions of people displaced, thousands killed, and tens of thousands arrested, charged, or sentenced by the military. And every morning we'd receive a report on security events that had happened across the country, and there would just be like line by line of arson, shelling, ground assaults on villages, scorched earth campaigns where they burn entire villages to the ground. Of course, killing, torture, displaced communities with no food to eat, no shelter, no safe place to go. So we saw and heard many of the terrible things our colleagues and their families had to go through at this time as well. And we had offices kind of spread out throughout the country. So the quote I read at the beginning of my talk was from a Myanmar colleague who became displaced during the fighting in her community. She was with us in the early days of when we start our office and we were building our team, and then continued until our office was eventually forced to close. And while she had previously provided food assistance to displaced people, she then became someone who was displaced, her and her family, and needed food assistance herself. And a number of other teammates were also displaced and had to run away from their home villages that were facing shelling, ground assaults, and airstrikes. One colleague had to run away in the middle of the night as the Myanmar military invaded her village, and she could only bring one item with her as she was running away, and she decided to bring her work laptop because she wanted to prioritize work's property over her own. For our Myanmar office, the main focus, the main sectors that we were focusing on as an office were clean water and sanitation, maternal and child health, and anti-human trafficking. But our program quickly shifted towards emergency response and emergency relief due to the impact of the coup that happened in 2021. And so we continued in subsequent years to do that emergency response. So work became very difficult in an environment that was hostile to humanitarian assistance. The military junta has a strategy they call the 4 cuts, and the whole point is to kind of block resistance groups from receiving resources, which includes food, financing, recruits, and information. So they had these military checkpoints set up, all over the place. And then they would check everyone, that all the traffic that's going through, what are you bringing, where are you bringing it to, who you bring it to, why, etc. And a lot of the times they would confiscate the supplies. They still do confiscate the supplies, and would take humanitarian supplies for themselves, or they would just destroy it. So I do remember there was one organization who had a truckload of rice that they were bringing to a community of people in need, an internally displaced people camp. And so they were transporting this, and the military, they just took the rice and they burned it. They didn't even take it for themselves. And it's also very common for them to target civilians, villages, displaced people camps and schools in airstrikes because they think that the local community will put pressure on resistance groups to stand down because they're getting hurt. So that's been a part of their strategy as well. So the quote that I read from Ma Bui at the very beginning of my talk, I wanted to read part 2. So she continues on. And previously she was talking about the sound of jet fighters and like the jet fighters dropping bombs and her 2-year-old daughter pointing out to the bomb shelter, warning her family about it. And so her quote continues. I really miss our team and sometimes shed tears. One of the good points of staying in the new town that I fled to is that I can participate in ministry. I preached at one of the Buddhist monasteries that has been housing displaced people. I was very excited and nervous that day. There were many displaced people there. There were also many non-believers, and even the Buddhist monk came to listen to my preaching. There were also others who stopped in to listen as people came to the nearby hospital. As all are in difficult situations, I want to be like shade to them. All are experiencing much more difficult situations than me. We will continue praying. I believe that God prepares the best for us. So Ma Bui's example of ministering to others, even as she herself is experiencing displacement, hunger, and trauma, it's a fulfillment of a devotions message that one of our Myanmar colleagues gave one morning. And this is before, in the days leading up to our office having to being forced to close. So we work for a Christian organization, right? And so every morning we had morning devotions together. We had offices across the country, so we would all kind of dial into this morning devotions. And our Myanmar project manager, shared something that he felt that God really impressed on his heart. And he referenced Matthew 14:19, when God, he blesses, breaks, and multiplies the loaves and the fish. And he related that to our situation, that our team had been blessed and we were being broken, and now we needed to be multiplied. So this perspective of fruit coming out of brokenness, it dovetailed with a verse that a number of us had independently felt placed on our hearts during this time. And that was specifically Isaiah 43:19, which was read, "Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert." And this is when God is speaking to the people of Israel through the prophet Isaiah, promising that he will do something new and seemingly impossible. And in this verse, we see that God promises a way. He promises a river, a lifeline in a harsh and desolate place. And I think it's so hard to hold on to these two things in tension, like the desert and the river. The desert and the river. On the one hand, we feel like the desert, we feel it so acutely. I think our physical senses are overwhelmed by the scarcity of the environment we're in and the pain of being in it, the unanswered prayers. It can feel like you're being dragged into hopelessness and despair. And there are thoughts that come to mind in the desert, questions. Is God really who he says he is? Why hasn't he come? Why hasn't he intervened when I've asked him to? On the other hand, there's the promise of the river, and Isaiah 43:19 seems to indicate that it's possible to miss it. It says, "Do you not perceive it?" And we continually saw the staff remind themselves and each other that there is a river. There is a river here. We saw them living out the Psalms in real life. Like they grieved the desert. They felt it so acutely. And they asked God the tough questions. And often very rarely did they receive any answers to those questions. But they would continue to place hope in front of themselves, to remind themselves about who God is, who he has been, and who he will continue to be. And I think Psalm 13 illustrates the heart posture of our colleagues so well. I just want to read it for you now. How long will you forget me, Lord? Forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long will I be left to my own wits, agony filling my heart daily? How long will my enemy keep defeating me? Look at me, answer me, Lord my God. Restore sight to my eyes, otherwise I'll sleep the sleep of death, and my enemy will say, I won. My foes will rejoice over my downfall. But I have trusted in your faithful love. My heart will rejoice in your salvation. Yes, I will sing to the Lord, because he has been good to me. I think there's a time to sit in grief and sorrow, and I think that's so important. It's really important to be honest with God. And I think that this in itself can be an act of worship. You know, when we continue to vent to and appeal to the one who we recognize is above all things and can change all things. I think that is an act of worship. And maybe it takes time. You know, maybe we find ourselves slowly living through the psalm and we haven't quite got to the hope part yet. And I think that's okay. But I also think that there will be a time to place hope in front of ourselves. And to admit that I don't know why. I don't have all the information. I can't see the spiritual landscape beyond the physical one right in front of me. I don't know what's happening in the minds of others or behind closed doors, but I do believe that there is life in choosing to trust that he still is who he says he is. Good, faithful, loving, patient, merciful. And one thing that I learned about myself, especially as I came back to the West, was that I can be afraid of hope. Like, I can be afraid to put all of my hope in God. Because if I put all of my hope in God, and I wait, and he doesn't come through in the way that I hope or expect him to, man, that's gonna hurt. I'm gonna be disappointed. But our colleagues, they continue to keep their hearts in that vulnerable position. They keep coming back to God, keep asking, keep looking, keep expecting, keep remembering. They keep placing that hope in front of themselves. And they keep reminding themselves of who God has been, who he is, and who he will continue to be. For Ma Bui, she experienced shelling and armed conflict very near her home, and she had to hide with her family underneath their bed. And do you know what she was doing under her bed with her family? She was praying for healing for my mom's migraines. So even as her situation in the village was deteriorating in real time, she was asking for intervention and more. Somehow, she wasn't afraid of hope. She had the courage to hope. Another colleague wrote, "I put my trust in God. As a human being, what I can do is limited. The situation may seem hopeless. It may seem something I never dreamed I would face. but it is nothing compared to Jesus dying on the cross for us. Our Myanmar colleagues' message about being blessed, broken, and multiplied illustrated the ongoing heart posture. The ongoing heart posture of our national colleagues and how they chose to look for how God was working, even in the face of pain and chaos. They were actively looking for God's rivers, reminding themselves that they were there. And in that process, I believe that God used them to become part of his river in the desert as well. Since our office closure, we have seen many examples of how God has used our national colleagues to become part of that river in the desert. They have become a blessing to others. And many of them are still active in the provision of humanitarian assistance, which can be quite dangerous, as I previously mentioned. And one close friend, she was actually abducted at a military checkpoint because they searched through her phone and they found messages that seemed to indicate that she was helping people in need. And so they put a cloth bag over her head and took her to an interrogation outpost. She had no idea where she was. No one knew where she was. And, one woman and then male military soldiers. And you can imagine how risky that situation would have felt to her. And she said she kept thinking of her 1-year-old son back at home and if she would ever see him again. And by the grace of God, she was let go. And she still continues to help people in need in the ways that she can. We have another colleague who is an incredible prayer warrior. And one day she felt that God was asking her to physically stand and pray in every state and division in Myanmar because evil had rooted itself into the ground, into the land. So she felt called to go and physically prayer walk in these areas. And so she started a prayer group and personally traveled with or without companions to every state and division in Myanmar through areas of active conflict. She would prayer walk the town that they felt called to and evangelize to anyone that they met. And people have been responding. Witnessing the heart posture of our Myanmar friends and colleagues was the catalyst for wanting to share those stories with people across the world. And this theme from Isaiah 43:19 became the backbone of a book that members of our former team put together called Desert River. In this book, our Myanmar colleagues seek to encourage others with the reminder that God is providing a river. And with their testimonies, it's their intention to place hope in front of themselves and in front of others. And through the sale of the book, they want to raise funds for humanitarian assistance in Myanmar. So as I wrap up, I actually received a message from Ma Boy the other day before yesterday. And I want to share with you what she's written. She just wrote to me. She says, "There are currently 103 displaced people in my mother's church. Some people are unable to return home, and some end up homeless. They feel stressed and sad and they have to go to the hospital and take medication. Some people are not Christians but participate in church activities such as fasting and prayer, believing that God is preparing better things ahead instead of the old possessions destroyed in war and conflict. Before, there was a clinic opened in our village. When a clinic was opened and operated in our church, the villagers were scared because the military flew over every day and night, bombing the village with drones and combat aircraft. During that time, we were unable to sleep. We had to flee to the nearby forest. Patients injured by large weapons, battle wounds, and landmines were treated at that clinic. At that time, the young people from church did their best, gathering to help, pray, and encourage the community. However, when the military bombarded the area with fighter jets, They could no longer continue. The number of patients also increased sharply. Then the clinic had to be moved to another location due to the military bombing. Regardless of that situation, the church members and those fleeing the war have continued their dawn prayers every morning, evening worship, Sunday fasting prayers, Bible study, and whole night prayers regularly. For that, some non-Christians said, God protects us, and we no longer need to flee because Christians pray to their God faithfully. A non-Christian was baptized because of this case. I kindly would like to ask for your prayers for those fleeing the war. When I stayed in a new town, I couldn't sleep at night due to the constant barking of dogs and the pervasive sense of danger. Some youth were violently arrested by the military to enforce the conscription law, and their parents came pouring out their hearts in tears. All I could do was feel sorry for them. I couldn't help them effectively. I worried for my son too. Though he is only 15, he looks older and is at high risk of being forcibly conscripted into the military. So we had to travel with our son to the Thai border to enroll him in a refugee school. We eagerly hope to someday share our past experiences as beautiful testimonies of God's protection and grace once the war is over. So our friends have a saying that pain is not a competition. And I don't share these stories to shame you at all. People have it so much worse than you, so buck up, or, Myanmar believers have so much faith, why don't you? That is absolutely not the message that I'm trying to send today, and neither is our team. I think that we all face deserts in our lives. And I think it's the reality of living in this broken world. For me, coming back to the West about a year and a half ago, it's been a struggle to find work. Professionally, I'm like, where do I fit in? How do I fit in? Do I fit in? When I first prayed about work, I asked God for closed doors when closed doors were needed, and then, of course, open doors for the right opportunities. But there have been a lot of closed doors, and it has been very humbling, even humiliating. I know what I want to do, but all the other opportunities that I've gone for, and even the ones remotely similar to my past experience or my skill set, they've just been shut down. But I'm trying to take the heart posture of our Myanmar friends and recognize that, God is doing something here. He is doing something here, even though I don't feel it. But he is doing something. Today, I want to encourage you with a reminder from Myanmar Christians that God has promised a river. So please hold on. In whatever desert you're facing, something is happening. Maybe quietly, maybe secretly, but the seeds he's planted in you, they're sprouting in the dark, in some deep, dark place, in a lonely place, in a quiet place. I believe that restoration has begun. Maybe it's just a trickle, but it's there. And just as it suggests in Isaiah 43:19, I think it's possible to miss it. So I want to encourage you to look for his rivers, to trust that they're there. If you feel led, please do remember to pray for Myanmar. Together with Myanmar Christians, our team wrote a 7-day prayer guide for Myanmar. And I just want to thank you so much to OAC's prayer group as well for taking this prayer guide on and hearing the prayer requests directly from Myanmar Christians. I'd love to end with a quote from our Myanmar colleague, and then I do have a video trailer. I hope it will work, and we'll see, but I do have a video trailer of the book that the team put together because it illustrates a lot of what we talked about today. So just to end with a quote. Our colleague says, "Dear friends, what burden are you carrying in your life?
Is it a job? Is it health? Is it livelihood? If you can't fix it yourself, don't despair. Put it in God's hands. Remember that God can do all things. God will give you peace and depth of life. I want you to believe that God has a great love and a great plan for you. And I pray for all of you to receive God's joy, peace, and hope in your life. Amen.